Coming up on The World Today, EU proposes to begin membership talks with Ukraine once conditions met. President Zelensky calls it the right step in history. Leaders of the G7 group of countries have insisted that their support for Ukraine will never waver, even amid growing tension in the Middle East. At a G7 meeting in Japan, the bloc's foreign ministers said they recognized that Russia was prepared for a long war. They are now reiterating their continuous support for Kiev, both economically and militarily. The group of rich countries is being at the forefront of sanctions on Moscow since last year's invasion. In Tokyo, the governments of the G7 countries, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Canada, and the US, as well as the EU representatives, said the Israel-Gaza war should not distract from support for Ukraine.
It will send a clear message to the international community that we as the G7 stand with Ukraine, even while the international attention tends to be on the Middle East.
In the meantime, top European Union officials are recommending that Ukraine be invited to begin membership talks as soon as it meets final conditions. This is seen as taking Kiev a step closer to major strategic goals, even as it struggles to repel Russia's invasion. The European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, at the Brussels press conference says the talks should formally be launched once Kiev satisfied remaining conditions related to stepping up fight against corruption, adopting a law on lobbying in line with the EU standards, and of course strengthening national minority safeguards. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is welcoming the EU executive's recommendation, describing it as a right step in history. The recommendation is seen as an important milestone of Kiev's road to Western integration and a geopolitical gambit for the European Union, as Ukraine has been fighting against the large-scale Russian invasion since February last year. Senior fellow at a Bruegel think tank, Heather Grab, has said that this nod from the European Union Commission to start membership negotiations with Ukraine is actually vital for Kiev and a very big boost to reform the country. The progress report from Ukraine is expected to inform a key decision in December at a summit of EU's national leaders on whether to start formal membership negotiations with Ukraine.
Amilyen mértékig lehetséges. Köszönetet is szeretnék mondani, hogy
в сегодняшних геополитических условиях.
This is a vital step for Ukraine. It's geopolitically important because it shows that Ukraine is on its way to becoming a member state of the EU. It's a fully European country. It's also very important for the reform process in Ukraine. At the moment, there's martial law, which means it's quite hard to maintain democratic oversight. There's been suspension of a number of important things in, for example, money laundering. And so this report by the Commission will set out the homework that needs to be done for Ukraine to make progress even while still in an active conflict. I don't think that the government, the Fidesz government in Budapest, will actually block the start. What they will ask for probably is some kind of concession in another area. That's typically what they've done in holding up, for example, the funds that are going to Ukraine to support the government budget, for example. We've also seen this in NATO in terms of the accession process of Sweden, which Hungary is also still blocking along with Turkey. So there will be some negotiations, but I think it would be very difficult for any European government at this point in time to say we can't send this positive signal to Ukraine. It's really vital to send it.
Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has held talks in Moscow with a senior Chinese military official discussing steps to deepen cooperation. At that meeting with General Zhang Yuxia, Vice Chairman of China's Central Military Commission, General Shoigu said relations between Russia and China are an example of strategic interaction based on trust and respect, unlike some, quote, aggressive Western countries. It is the second time the two men had met in the space of 10 days following talks on the sidelines of a forum that Mr. Shoigu attended in Beijing on October the 30th. Presidents Vladimir Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping have proclaimed a no-limit partnership less than 3 weeks before Russia sent its troops into Ukraine just last year, and China has refrained from criticizing Moscow's actions there. The United States has warned Beijing against supplying Russia with weapons. Away from that now, checking in with another lingering war of the African continent. We're talking about Sudan. Nearly 6 million people have been internally displaced within the country since the month of April this year, when the war began, while more than 1.2 million have fled to neighboring countries like Chad, Egypt, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and the Central African Republic. However, there are reports of ethnic killings by the Rapid Support Forces and the allied militias in Sudan's Darfur region, causing people to flee the renewed violence into neighboring Chad.
Hundreds of thousands of displaced Sudanese fleeing are struggling to find shelter, with many people sleeping under trees by the roadside. People fleeing to Chad reported a new surge in ethnically driven killings in Sudan's west, Darfur, as the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces RSF took over the main army base in the state capital, El Geneina. Women were seen weeping as they received the news that their family members were killed in the violence back home.
Our people there in Admata were killed and displaced. Children are slaughtered. Women's money and belongings are robbed. And they can't escape.
The United Nations Refugee Agency is very concerned about them not having access to food, shelter, and clean drinking water.
The situation is dire. We're lacking shelter, we're lacking water, we're lacking food, and all of the UN, the NGO community is coming together, but it's simply not sufficient for the needs. We are so concerned. You're talking about 6 million people that have been displaced, both inside Sudan as well as in all of the neighboring countries, and that because of a conflict that can be stopped. We need a ceasefire. We need a political solution so that these people can go home safely and go back to school, go back to their jobs, and start their life again. This simply cannot continue.
Meanwhile, the executive director of the United Nations Population Fund, Natalia Kanem, speaks about the situation in Chad.
Chad today faces multiple challenges and a humanitarian emergency. Instability, violence in neighboring countries, and the disproportionate impact of a climate crisis, not of its own making, not to mention socioeconomic and other development challenges. Despite being one of the poorest countries in the world, Chad now hosts more than 1 million refugees, including newly some 500,000 who fled the conflict in Sudan over the past 6 months, most women and children. Many of the women are victims of gender-based violence in the countries that they fled and or in the camps where they're now living. In my visit to a UNFPA-run one-stop center for violence survivors in Mundu in the south of Chad on Friday, I spoke to girls and young women who shared heartbreaking stories of pain and suffering.
According to the International Organization for Migration, the war in Sudan has caused a major humanitarian crisis and the displacement of more than 6 million people. Schools have also been shut for the last 7 months as displaced people find temporary shelter inside the classrooms. The education and the future prospects of millions of children in Sudan are also at risk.
Welcome back. The White House is urging caution as polls showing President Joe Biden lagging behind leading Republican candidate Donald Trump. According to a New York Times and CNN college poll, which was released on Sunday, Mr. Biden trails Mr. Trump in 5 of the 6 most important battleground states a year before the election of 2024. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre says that these polls should be taken with a grain of salt, listing past instances when polls failed to accurately predict races' outcomes.
I am also a part of
The Fifth Circuit's opinion in Rahimi is really maybe the most prominent, thus at least, Court of Appeals decision applying the Supreme Court's decision from the summer of 2022 in a case called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. And what was really important about Bruin, and I think why we get the result in Rahimi, is that the Supreme Court said that from now on, the constitutionality of modern gun laws should be determined not based on things like whether the laws
Apologize for that. That's on gun violence, but we'll bring you the stories on that later. Let's continue with Australia, where millions of people are left without a phone or internet connection today when Optus, which is the nation's second largest telecommunications provider, experienced an unexplained nationwide outage. The outage crippled payment systems and online operations, leading to morning peak hour chaos as train networks and rideshare services were all temporarily grounded in some cities. The outage also affected hospitals and emergency services across the country. And officials are saying that some services are gradually being restored, but Optus is giving no estimated time for full restoration of its services.
So what we do know is that this is a deep fault. It has occurred deep within the network. It has wide ramifications across mobile, fixed and broadband services for Optus customers. It also means that for those customers, they are being impacted by the inability to make calls or use their services. I make this clear again, and I said this from the first thing this morning. I think Optus needs to make sure they step up and communicate with people because, as I understand it, this started in the early hours of this morning. We're now at 11 o'clock. And for a lot of people who are trying to get on with their day and their businesses, this is absolutely vital that they get back to normality. So again, I would urge Optus to utilise every channel available, including the broadcast media, to make sure that these messages get across.
To weather now, the Deputy Director of the Climate Change Services, Samantha Burgess, has declared that 2023 is guaranteed to be the hottest year on record due to unprecedented temperature anomalies. She is saying that October 2023 has been identified as the warmest October globally, according to historical data. She has emphasized the pressing need for urgent and ambitious climate action leading up to COP28.
October 2023 was the warmest October on record globally, with an average surface temperature of 15.3 degrees Celsius. What this means is this last month was 0.85 degrees Celsius above the recent average and 0.4 degrees Celsius above the previous warmest October. So the only time that we've ever had a bigger difference between the previous warmest month and the current one is last month in September. So October 2023 is almost as shocking as September 2023 was. It's not a surprise because we've been monitoring the climate very carefully. And when we look at the global heat content in the ocean, in the atmosphere, and in the land surface, in terms of the heat waves that we've had across the planet over the last month of October, but before that as well, we're expecting October to be warmer than average. But what this means is this month we can say with almost complete certainty that 2023 is the warmest year on record, and it now beats the previous warmest year by 0.1 degrees Celsius, and the previous warmest year was 2016. So on record for us, our data set, ERA 5, goes back to 1940. But actually, when we combine our data with the IPCC, then we can say that this is the warmest year for the last 125,000 years. So for the last 125,000 years, that's obviously not instrumental data and satellite data like what we're using, but it's data from proxies, so from cave deposits, coral deposits, tree rings, ice cores that go back through time to give us an estimate of what the temperature and what the climate is. It is climate change driven. And when we look at the data, we can say that the extra heat in the Earth system comes from a range of different locations. So if we look at different latitudinal bands of the planet, then we can say that there's, in October, extra heat coming from the Northern Hemisphere land, most of all, and also extra heat coming from the equatorial ocean region. So we know that most of this extra heat is coming north of the equator, and it's a combination of extra heat on land and in the atmosphere and in the ocean.
Now, how would you react when your food unexpectedly disappears from the porch where it was placed, only to discover later that it was actually taken by a hungry bear? A hungry bear took your meal. This was the predicament of a family in Orlando, Florida, who found out that the bear stole their food delivered to a front porch. Images of the bear were caught on a Ring camera as it was seen taking the package in its mouth and then walking away from the scene. The family ended up very confused on the porch, repeating in disbelief, the bear took the food.
Ay, ese ¿será que se la llevó? Ale, mira la cámara. Pero no.
El oso se llevó la comida, el oso se llevó la comida.
Well, I would be extremely confused. But finally on the program today, the largest internally flawless, fancy, vivid blue diamond ever put for auction has now sold for a staggering $43.8 million at a Christie's sale of rare jewels in Geneva. The vivid blue diamond, known as Blue Royale and set in a ring, is among the rarest ever to be unearthed. At 17.6 carats, the diamond had an estimated value of up to $50 million prior to that sale. At the auction, Christie's sold dozens of rare jewelry pieces worth a combined total of more than $77 million.
290,000 francs. What's up, I'm going to get and lot number 87, the final lot of our sale. For 108,000 francs. The stone made almost $44 million. It's a huge amount of money, given what's going on in the world today. Made $2.5 million a carat. And you saw there were 3 very interested parties who took their time chasing the stone to the final price. So we are very pleased.
Well, it was an absolutely gorgeous diamond, the largest vivid blue flawless diamond ever offered for sale at auction. It was 17.61 carats and also internally flawless, which is extremely rare. It's been in the same family collection for over 40 years. It's the first time it's ever appeared for sale at auction. It had a really deep, saturated, rich blue color, and also was an unmodified pear brilliant shape. So it really ticked all the boxes, which is why we managed to excite collectors all around the world, all the way from the Far East also to America. So we're extremely delighted with the result. You know, coming into these sales, you always have some trepidation about how things are gonna perform. And at the end of the day, we were over 90% sold by lot, which is extremely high. The sell-through rate by value was also, very, very successful. So it's clear that the market is still very strong in certain areas. Colored stones performed extremely well, as did signed jewelry. Selling a pair of Cartier Art Deco earrings for over $500,000. The cashmere sapphires did extremely well. There's a great market out there for rare things, and there's still collectors looking for the very best.
Well, at almost $44 million, now you know why they say diamonds are forever. That's how we end the show today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Anne Nwawadu. Stay safe.